Edward Brown sat in his spacious office on the 30th floor, staring at the financial statements. His fingers tapped nervously on the polished surface of his desk, and his brow furrowed more and more with each page he turned. "This is impossible," he muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. "Something doesn't add up here." He pressed the intercom button. "Margaret, could you please bring me the car service reports for the last 6 months?" "Of course, Mr. Brown," the secretary replied. "I'll have them for you in 5 minutes." Edward walked over to the panoramic window. The city was bustling below, but his thoughts were far away. 3 years ago, he had bought a car service network, invested a lot of money in it, and modernized the equipment. Everything was going great until Margaret brought him the folders with the reports. "Thank you," he nodded. "You can go home now. It's late." "Are you sure? Is there anything else you need?" she asked caringly. "No, I'm fine. Good night." Left alone, Edward spread the documents on the table. His eyes rested on the profit figures for the largest service in the city center. "Tom," he whispered, remembering the conversation with the manager last week, "you're hiding something from me." Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was Alex, his CFO. "Edward, are you still here? I thought everyone had already left." "Come in," Brown replied. "Look at this." Alex walked over to the desk and bent over the papers. "What exactly are you worried about?" "Here, look. Parts costs have gone up 40%, but the number of customers has remained almost the same. At the same time, profits are falling, even though we've raised prices." Alex studied the numbers carefully. "Could it be because of inflation? Prices for spare parts are also rising." Edward shook his head. "No, something is not right here. I can feel it in my gut. Someone is stealing my money, and I intend to find out who." "What are you going to do?" Alex asked, sitting down in the chair across from him. Edward was silent for a long time, looking out the window. Then he turned to his friend. "I have a plan. It's crazy, but it might work." "I know you," Alex sighed. "When you say that, it means something dangerous." "I'm going to get a job at that service station as a simple mechanic." Alex jumped out of his chair. "Are you crazy?" "Edward, you're a millionaire. How can you—" "That's exactly why it will work," Brown interrupted him. "No one would expect to see the owner of a company as a mere mechanic." "And if you get caught?" "They won't. I grew up in my father's garage, remember? I know everything about cars." Alex shook his head. "It's risky. Let's just hire a private detective." "No," Edward said firmly. "I need to see everything with my own eyes, feel what's going on from the inside." Silence fell. The day was fading outside the window, and the city lights were coming on one by one. "Okay," Alex finally said. "What do you need me to do?" "Prepare the documents for David Miller, and don't tell anyone." "What about your daughter?" "Elizabeth has a right to know." Edward sighed. "No. The fewer people who know, the better. Tell her I'm going on a business trip." "For how long?" "As long as it takes. I feel like this is a big deal, Alex, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it." Brown gathered the papers and put them in the safe. His eyes burned with the excitement of the hunt. "Edward," Alex called to him at the door. "Be careful. Always," he smiled. "By the way, how do you like my new role?" He took off his jacket, ruffled his hair, and slouched, instantly transforming from a confident businessman to a tired worker. "Impressive," Alex shook his head, "but it's still crazy. The best decisions often seem that way." Left alone, Edward looked over the documents again. He was in for a tough game, but he was ready. For too long, someone had taken advantage of his trust. It was time to stop it. Monday morning greeted Edward with a gray dawn. He stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, which he had rented specifically for this operation, a simple one-bedroom apartment in a residential neighborhood, just the kind of place a simple mechanic would rent. "Well, let's see," he muttered, looking at his reflection. Instead of an expensive suit, he was wearing worn jeans and an old t-shirt. The $50,000 watch had been replaced by a simple $20 digital timer. He ran his hand through his stubble, which he had grown on purpose over the past week. The phone rang, a new, simple phone, not a smartphone. "Yes, Alex? The documents are ready," his friend said. "Are you sure about this?" "More than ever," Edward replied, pulling on a worn baseball cap. "How is Elizabeth?" "She believes the business trip story, but you know your daughter. She senses that something is wrong." Edward sighed. "Tell her I'll call her tonight, and make sure she doesn't come to the office." "Okay. Good luck, David Miller." Edward smiled and hung up. Half an hour later, he parked his old Ford in front of Auto Pro, the largest service center in his chain. His heart was pounding, like a young thief before his first theft. Two mechanics were smoking at the entrance. One of them, a burly man in his 40s, gave him an appraising look. "You're new?" "Yes," Edward nodded, trying to keep it simple. "David, the agency sent me." "Oh, right. Tom said they were sending someone. I'm Mike. Nice to meet you." "Don't jump to conclusions," the other mechanic, a skinny guy with tattoos, chuckled. "Let's see if you can last more than a week here." Edward held back a smile. If they only knew. The office space was dirty and cramped. The lockers needed painting, and there were old calendars with models hanging on the walls. "I'll have to change this," Edward thought, but then jerked himself away. "David?" he heard a voice say. Tom, the service manager, approached him. "Good to see you. Do you have your papers with you?" "Yes, of course." Edward handed over the papers Alex had prepared. Tom skimmed through them. "Good work experience. Why did you leave your previous job?" "The service closed," Edward replied with a story he had prepared in advance. "The owner went bankrupt." Tom nodded. "It happens. Well, the rules are simple. Shift from 8 to 6, an hour for lunch. Salary is as agreed. Probationary period, 1 month. A month is enough for me," Edward thought. "Mike," Tom called out. "Show the new guy around." The burly mechanic looked up from his coffee. "Come on, let's see what you can do." For the next 2 hours, Edward demonstrated his skills. He deliberately did some things a little slower than he could have done. He didn't want to stand out as too professional. "Not bad," Mike admitted after Edward finished repairing the carburetor. "But we have our own ways of working here. Do you understand?" There was something strange in his voice, some kind of hidden threat. Edward just nodded, pretending not to notice. Before lunch, he met the rest of the team. Peter, a senior mechanic, Robert, an electrical specialist, and Chris, a young apprentice. They all seemed like normal guys, but Edward noticed small details, the intense glances they exchanged, the quiet conversations that stopped when he got closer. During the lunch break, he sat off to the side, watching. The mechanics stayed in groups, discussing things in whispers. From time to time, Tom would come out of his office, throw quick glances at the workers, and disappear again. "Hey, new guy," Robert called to him. "How's your first day?" "Fine," Edward shrugged. "There's a lot of work." "That's good," Robert smiled. "It means I'll be making money. By the way, are you married?" "Divorced." "Oh, that's good." Robert was happy for some reason. "It means you can work overtime if you need to. It happens a lot here." Edward felt his heart beat faster. This was the first hint that something untoward was going on. The day dragged on slowly. Edward repaired cars, wiped grease off his hands, joked with his colleagues. Everything a simple mechanic should do. But his eyes never stopped watching. In the evening, when most of the workers had left, he overheard a conversation between Tom and Peter. "We need to be more careful," Tom said, "especially now, with the new guy." "Don't worry," Peter replied. "I'll keep an eye on him." Edward slipped quietly out into the street. As he got into his old Ford, he smiled. The first day had been a success. He was sure that something serious was going on here, and he would get to the bottom of it. Returning to his temporary apartment, he took out a new notebook and wrote down all his observations. Then he stood in the shower for a long time, washing off the grease and dirt. The phone rang, this time his personal, secure phone. "Dad?" came Elizabeth's voice. "How was your business trip?" "Everything's fine, honey," he answered, feeling a pang of guilt. "Lots of work." "You've been acting strange lately. Did something happen?" "No, nothing. I'm just tired. Don't worry about me." "Okay. Good night, Dad." "Good night, sweetheart." Edward put the phone down and walked over to the window. The city lights flickered below, and somewhere in the darkness was a mystery he had to solve. Tomorrow would be a new day, new observations, and he would not stop until he found out the truth. A week has passed since Edward started working at the car repair shop. He came in earlier than usual to prepare his workplace. The sun was barely breaking through the dirty windows of the workshop. "First one in again?" He heard the voice of Chris, a young apprentice, entering the room. "You're weird, David. All normal people try to come at the last minute." Edward shrugged his shoulders. "Old habit. I like to have everything prepared. As you wish." Chris yawned and went to change. A few minutes later, other mechanics began to appear. Mike, as always, looked gloomy. "Hey, new guy. We have a big day today. The auditor from the head office is coming." Edward almost dropped his wrench. He knew nothing about the audit. "Really?" he asked calmly. "It means you have to keep your mouth shut and do everything Tom says," Peter interjected, coming closer. "Got it?" Edward nodded, feeling his insides boiling with indignation. At 9, Tom appeared, dressed in a suit instead of his usual work clothes. He was followed by a young woman in a business suit with a folder in her hands. "Attention, everyone!" Tom called out. "This is Miss Anderson from the main office. She will be conducting a routine inspection." Interesting, Edward thought. Alex didn't say anything about an inspection. Something is wrong here. Miss Anderson began to walk around the room, taking notes. Edward noticed Tom nod imperceptibly to Peter, who quickly walked toward the warehouse. "Mr. Miller," Miss Anderson suddenly addressed him. "Are you a new employee?" "Yes, ma'am," Edward answered, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've been working here for a week. And how do you like the working conditions?" "Everything is fine," he noticed Tom tense up. "The team is friendly. The equipment is good. I'm glad to hear it." She smiled and moved on. After she left, Tom breathed a sigh of relief. "Well done, David. You answered correctly." Edward nodded and went back to work, but he was watching what was happening out of the corner of his eye. He noticed Robert quietly moving some papers from one cabinet to another, Mike quickly replacing a few price tags on spare parts. During his lunch break, he overheard a conversation between Tom and Miss Anderson. "Everything looks good, Mr. Thompson," she said. "But these numbers—" "I'll explain everything," Tom interrupted her. "Let's discuss it in my office." Edward felt his suspicions growing. He pulled out his phone and texted Alex. "Check in with Miss Anderson from the control room. Something is not right here." In the afternoon, an expensive Mercedes pulled into the workshop. An elderly man was behind the wheel. "I have a knocking noise in the engine," he complained, "and the oil is leaking." "I'll take a look," Edward offered. He opened the hood and began to inspect the engine. After a while, Mike came over. "Well, what is it?" "We need to change the gasket and—" "Let me do it," Mike interrupted him. "You still have a lot of work to do." Edward walked away but continued to watch. He saw Mike explaining something to the Mercedes owner, pointing to different parts of the engine. The man was nodding, looking increasingly concerned. "This is a 3-day job at least," Edward heard Mike say, "and the parts are expensive." Bullshit, Edward thought. It's an hour's work at most. In the evening, when most of the workers had left, He stayed behind to finish repairing the old Volkswagen. Suddenly, he heard voices from the warehouse. "Everything went well," Tom said. "Anderson is happy." "How much this time?" someone asked. "The same as always. 20% for her, the rest for us." Edward quietly crept closer, trying to hear more, but at that moment the door creaked open and he quickly went back to work. "Still here, David?" Tom asked as he came out of the warehouse. "Yeah, I want to get this Volkswagen done." "Okay, but don't take too long, and don't forget to lock everything up." After Tom left, Edward pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to Alex. "We need to check all the invoices for parts for the last 6 months and find information about all the inspectors who came during that time." On the way home, he thought about the events of the day. The scheme was becoming clearer and clearer. Inflated bills, fictitious repairs, bribed inspectors. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. He felt that the true scale of the fraud was yet to come. At home, he received a message from Alex. "Miss Anderson is not on the company's payroll. Who is she?" Edward sank heavily into his chair. So even the background checks were fake. How deep were the roots of this conspiracy? He took out a notebook and began to write down his observations, trying to connect all the pieces of the puzzle. One thing was clear. It was going to be more difficult than he had originally thought. The phone rang again, this time from Elizabeth. "Dad, when are you coming back? I don't like you being away for so long." "Soon, sweetheart," he replied. "Just be patient. You've been acting strange lately. What's wrong?" "Nothing, just a lot of work." After hanging up the phone, Edward went to the window. He hated lying to his daughter, but there was no other way out. He had to finish the job. Wednesday began with an unpleasant discovery. When Edward entered the workshop, he immediately felt the tension in the air. Old Betty, the janitor, who usually greeted everyone cheerfully, was silently wiping the floor, avoiding eye contact. Outside Tom's office, the mechanics were crowded together, whispering among themselves. "What's going on?" Edward asked Chris, who was putting away the tools. "There's going to be a big inspection," the guy whispered, looking around. Tom stayed in his office all night. "They say that profits have fallen by 30%. 30%, Edward thought. That's how much I suspected of fraud. Is someone else digging for them? At that moment, the office door opened abruptly. Tom came out, looking tired and irritated. "Everyone to the general meeting, now." The mechanics rushed to the break room. Edward took a seat in the corner where he could watch everyone. Tom stood in front of them, nervously tapping his pencil on the table. "The situation is difficult," he began. "There are fewer clients, competitors are interfering. But the main thing is that we have an inspection coming from the head office." A whisper went around the room. Mike raised his hand. "No," Tom shook his head. "This time it's more serious. Wilson himself is coming." Edward noticed how the faces of the senior mechanics paled. He made a mental note to check who Wilson was. "What do we do?" Peter asked. "For now, we work as usual," Tom answered. "But," he looked around at everyone, "be especially careful with the documentation. And no talk of additional income." So they're afraid of an audit, Edward thought. I wonder how deeply they are tied up. After the meeting, work went on as usual, but the atmosphere was tense. Edward noticed Robert and Peter actively discussing something near the warehouse, and Mike nervously shuffling some papers. Around 11 o'clock, a late-model black BMW pulled into the car service yard. A tall man in an impeccable suit got out of the car. Edward immediately realized that this was Wilson. His posture was commanding. His gaze was cold and judgmental. Tom flew out of the office as if shot. "Mr. Wilson, we didn't expect you so early. That's why I'm here now," the visitor cut him off. "Show me the documents." They disappeared into the office. Half an hour later, I heard raised voices from there. Edward, who worked nearby, tried to make out the words. "I can't cover you forever," Wilson's voice came through. "Sooner or later he'll notice." "Everything is under control," Tom answered. "Just a little slump." "A little? 30% is a small decline?" Edward almost dropped the wrench. Who was this he Wilson was talking about? Did they know about his investigation? During his lunch break, he decided to take a chance and went to the back room. It was a small room filled with old tools and boxes. Mechanics often gathered here to discuss things that could not be discussed in the common room. He was about to open the door when he heard muffled voices. "Everything is going to hell," Mike was saying. "There are fewer orders. Customers are complaining about prices." "And now Wilson's here," Peter shouted at him. "Not everyone needs to hear this." "What are we going to do?" Robert asked. "It used to be easier. We used to raise prices, exchange original parts for fakes, and everything worked. And now we have this new guy," Peter muttered. "He asks too many questions." "Do you think he suspects something?" "I don't know. But after he arrived, everything went wrong. First the profits dropped, then Wilson arrived. Maybe he—" Mike began, but suddenly fell silent. Edward heard footsteps and quickly backed away from the door. A second later, Tom appeared around the corner. "David, what are you doing here?" "I was looking for a screwdriver," Edward replied calmly, pointing to the broken tool in his hands. Tom looked at him intently. "Come on, let's talk." They walked to the far corner of the workshop. Tom looked around, making sure no one could hear them. "Listen, David, you're a smart man. You see how everything works here?" "I do," Edward answered cautiously. "And what do you think?" "I think everyone wants to make money." Tom smiled. "You're right. You know, we have a special system here. All mechanics have additional income, but you have to understand the rules of the game." "What are the rules?" "The main rule is less questions, more work. And also, to be able to keep your mouth shut. Do you understand?" Edward nodded. Tom patted him on the shoulder. "Think about it. We'll talk more tomorrow." After talking to Tom, Edward went back to work, but his mind was far away. He was trying to connect all the pieces of the puzzle. Wilson was clearly an important figure in this scheme, perhaps covering up for them from the top. But then, who was the he they were talking about? Later in the afternoon, an old Opel drove into the workshop. An elderly woman was behind the wheel. "Son," she said to Edward, "the car is making a strange noise." He examined the car and realized that the problem was minor. The muffler was loose. 5 minutes of work and $10 of spare parts. But then Robert came over. "I'll take care of it," he said, pulling Edward aside. "You still have that Toyota unfinished." Edward walked away but continued to watch. He saw Robert explain something at length to the woman, pointing to different parts of the engine. 20 minutes later, she went to the cash register holding a bill for $300. "Why?" Edward asked Robert quietly as he walked by. "It's just a muffler." Robert stopped and looked at him carefully. "Listen, my friend. Business is business. The old lady has money and we have families to feed. Everything is fair." "And if she complains? To whom?" Robert laughed. "To Tom? Or maybe Wilson. They are all in this together, believe me." This moment was a turning point for Edward. It was one thing to suspect fraud, but it was another to see defenseless people being blatantly deceived. In the evening, when he was about to go home, Peter stopped him. "Listen, David, Tom said he talked to you." "Yes, he did. What did you decide?" "I'm thinking about it." Peter lowered his voice. "Think fast. Everything could change after Wilson's visit. We need reliable people." At home, Edward sat for a long time over his notes. The scheme was becoming clearer. Fake parts, inflated bills, fake repairs, and worst of all, the deception of ordinary customers who trusted them with their cars and money. He pulled out his secure phone. "Alex, I need all the information about Wilson. He's a key figure." "Okay," his friend replied. "But be careful. If they offer you to enter the scheme—" "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Edward interrupted. "It's the only way we can get all the evidence." After the conversation, he stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the night city. Tomorrow was going to be an important day. They were clearly preparing a serious offer for him, and he had to play his part flawlessly. The phone rang. Elizabeth. "Daddy, I miss you so much. When are you coming back?" "Soon, darling," he answered, feeling his heart clench. "It won't be long now." "You've been acting strange lately. What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just a complicated project." "Promise you'll be back soon?" "I promise. And I'll never leave you for so long again." After hanging up the phone, Edward took out his notebook and started writing down his plan for tomorrow. He had to be prepared for anything. Tom would obviously invite him to enter the scheme, and this would be his chance to find out the truth. Edward woke up before dawn. Today was going to be a special day. He could feel it. Tom had promised a detailed conversation, and this was his chance to finally get concrete proof of the fraud. Arriving at the car repair shop earlier than usual, he noticed that the lights in Tom's office were already on. Two figures were visible through the blinds, Tom himself and a stranger. "Good morning, David," came a voice from behind him. It was Chris, a young student. "Do you know what's going on? Tom called everyone in at 8 and we usually start at 9. "I have no idea." Edward shrugged, although his heart was beating faster. At 8, the workshop was full. All the mechanics gathered in the main hall, waiting for Tom to show up. Finally, the door to his office opened. Tom came out, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit. "Not Wilson, someone else." "Good morning, everyone," Tom began. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Hoffman. He represents our new parts supplier." Edward looked at the stranger carefully. Something about him was wrong. Perhaps too expensive a suit for a regular supplier or too confident a posture. "Gentlemen," Hoffman spoke with a slight accent, "we offer you quality parts at the best prices, much better than those of authorized dealers." Fakes, Edward thought. So this is it. After the presentation, Tom took Edward aside. "Well, David, are you ready for a serious conversation?" "I'm always ready," he replied. "Good. Let's meet in my office after lunch." All morning, Edward worked as usual, but his mind was on the upcoming conversation. He noticed Hoffman talking to Peter about something for a long time near the warehouse, handing an envelope to Tom. Around 11 o'clock, a brand new Mercedes pulled into the workshop. The client, a young businessman, complained about a knocking noise in the engine. Edward started to inspect it, but was interrupted by Mike. "I'll take care of this client," he said. "You go to Tom's office. He's waiting for you." Tom's office was smoky. The manager himself and Hoffman were sitting at his desk. "Come in, David," Tom smiled. "Close the door." Edward sat down in the chair offered. Tom pulled a bottle of whiskey out of a drawer. "No, thanks. I'm driving." Hoffman nodded. "A cautious man. That's good." Tom poured himself a drink. "David, we've been watching you for a while. You're a good mechanic, you understand the business, and most importantly, you know how to keep your mouth shut. Thank you for your assessment. The thing is," Tom continued, "our business is special. We don't just fix cars. We help people save money, and we make good money ourselves." "How exactly?" Edward asked cautiously. Hoffman smiled. "Very simply. We supply spare parts at special prices. They look like the original ones, but cost much less." "And the quality?" "Quite acceptable," Tom said. "Not a single serious complaint in a year." Bullshit, Edward thought. I have data on 3 accidents due to defective parts. "What's my role?" he asked aloud. "Simple," Tom replied. You install these parts, bill them as if they were original. We split the difference. Everybody wins. Everyone. Well, almost everyone, Hoffman laughed. The customer pays less than at an authorized dealer, and we get our percentage. Even the original manufacturers don't suffer. They still make too much profit. Edward looked thoughtful. It sounds good, but is it safe? Absolutely, Tom assured him. Everything is going according to plan. Even the inspectors from the head office are our people. That's it, Edward thought. That's why Tom Wilson was so nervous. He's in on the action. So, are you in? Tom asked. Can I think about it until tomorrow? Sure, Hoffman nodded. But don't take too long. Offers like this don't wait around forever. Leaving the office, Edward headed for his car, ostensibly to get his tools. In reality, he needed to call Alex urgently. Is everything recorded? He asked. Yes, Alex replied. Every word of it. The microphone worked perfectly. Good. Now we need samples of these non-original parts. Organize an examination. Already on it. But be careful. These guys can be dangerous. Back in the workshop, Edward noticed Hoffman handing a package to Peter. He quickly hid it in his locker. In the late afternoon, when most of the workers had left, Edward stayed behind, ostensibly to finish the repairs. After waiting until the room was empty, he went to Peter's locker. The lock was easy to pick. No wonder he was fond of locksmithing in his youth. Inside was a bag of spare parts and, more importantly, a folder of documents. Edward quickly took a picture of everything on his secure phone. Suddenly he heard footsteps and barely had time to close the locker. Are you still here? It was Robert. Yeah, I'm just finishing up with the Volkswagen, Edward replied calmly, wiping his hands on a rag. Don't be long, Robert grumbled and left. At home, Edward looked at the photos he had taken for a long time. The documents contained lists of deliveries, prices, contacts, a real treasure trove for investigation. The phone rang. Elizabeth. Dad, are you okay? You've been acting strange lately. Everything is fine, dear. It's just a complicated project. When will you be back? Soon. Really soon. I promise. He hung up the phone and sighed heavily. He hated lying to his daughter, but he was too close to uncovering the whole scheme to stop now. The next morning, Edward came to work with a clear plan of action. He knew that he had to give Tom an answer today about participating in their scheme, and he intended to make the most of the situation. But as soon as he entered the workshop, he felt that something had changed. There was a police car parked at the entrance, and two officers were talking to Tom in the corner of the room. What happened? He asked Chris quietly. There was a break-in last night, he whispered. Someone went through the lockers. Nothing was stolen, but Edward felt his insides go cold. Had someone noticed his actions yesterday? Tom approached the mechanics. Okay, everyone, listen up. Someone broke into the workshop last night. The police will investigate. If you see anything suspicious, report to me immediately. His gaze lingered on Edward for a moment, but his expression remained impenetrable. Now let's get back to work. And so much time was wasted. Throughout the morning, Edward tried to work as usual, but he could feel the stares. Peter was watching him especially closely. Around 10 o'clock, an expensive Porsche Cayenne pulled into the workshop. An elegant middle-aged woman got out of the car. I have a problem with my brakes, she said. The authorized dealer said that the whole system needs to be changed, but it's too expensive. I'll take a look, Edward replied, opening the hood. He quickly identified the problem. The brake pads were worn out and one disc needed to be replaced. The job would take a couple of hours. What's wrong? The client asked. It's nothing, he began. We just need to replace. I'll take care of this car. Tom suddenly interrupted him, appearing as if from nowhere. You still have that Honda that's not finished, right? Edward nodded and walked away, but continued to watch. He saw Tom explain something to the woman for a long time, showing her different parts of the car. An hour later, she went to the cash register with a bill, which, judging by her expression, was quite large. "Why are you doing this?" Edward asked Tom quietly as he passed by. "It's a simple repair. That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Tom replied. "Come to my office this afternoon." The day dragged on slowly. Edward noticed Robert and Mike going to the warehouse several times with some boxes, and Peter talking for a long time on the phone, constantly looking back. Finally, it was time for the lunch break. Tom called him into the office. "So, David, have you thought about our proposal?" "I have," Edward nodded. "But I have a few questions." "Yes? These parts, are they really safe?" Tom laughed. "Of course they are. Do you think we'd risk it? It's just alternative suppliers. No brand name overpayment. What about the warranty?" "Don't worry about that. We've got that covered. By the way," Tom leaned closer, "if you're with us, your percentage will be higher than the others. I like you, David. There's something special about you." Edward looked thoughtful. "Okay, I'll do it." "Great." Tom held out his hand. "Welcome to the team." "Now what?" "Now I'll show you how it really works." They went to the warehouse. Tom unlocked the door and led Edward inside. "Look, these are the original parts," he pointed to one shelf. "And these are ours, special ones," he pointed to the other. "Do you see the difference?" "No," Edward answered honestly. "That's exactly the point." Tom laughed. "The client won't see it either, but the difference in price is 3 to 4 times. He took out a folder. "Here are the prices. The black ones are official prices. The red ones are ours. We divide the difference, half for you, half, let's say, for business development." Edward studied the documents carefully, trying to memorize every detail. "What about the paperwork?" Tom took out the other papers. "Here are the forms. You put in the official prices, and you get the difference in cash at the end of the week." "That's it," Edward thought. "That's why everything looks clean in the official reports." Suddenly, Peter appeared in the doorway. "Tom, there's a customer with a complaint. He says the pads we installed last week are already worn out." "I'll be right there," Tom replied. "David, get used to it. You're one of us now." When they left, Edward quickly took out his phone and took pictures of all the documents. It was exactly the evidence he needed. On his way home that evening, he felt a mixture of triumph and anxiety. The plan had worked. He had gained access to the entire scheme. But now the game had become even more dangerous. At home, he looked at the photos he had taken for a long time. The scheme was large-scale, fake spare parts, inflated bills, fake repairs, and it was all covered up at the highest level. The phone rang. "Alex." "Well?" "Everything worked out. I have documents, prices, supply chains. Now I need to somehow transfer it all to you. Be careful. If they suspect something, I know, but I have no choice. I have to finish this." Late in the evening, I received a text from Elizabeth. "Dad, I found your old notebook with your notes. Is something going on? Why won't you tell me the truth?" Edward sighed heavily. His daughter had always been too smart. But now he couldn't tell her the truth. It was not yet time. "You'll understand soon," he wrote back. "Just trust me." Friday was particularly tense. From the very morning, Edward noticed that the atmosphere in the workshop had changed. The mechanics were whispering more than usual. Tom was nervously looking out the window several times, and Peter was constantly on the phone. Around 10 in the morning, a familiar black BMW pulled into the workshop. Wilson got out of the car, but this time he was not alone. There was another man with him whom Edward had never seen before. "Who's that with Wilson?" he asked Robert quietly. "I don't know," he answered, but his voice was trembling. But Tom had been on edge all morning about the visit. Wilson and the stranger disappeared into Tom's office. Half an hour later, raised voices were heard from there. "This is unacceptable," came an unfamiliar voice. "You're attracting too much attention." "Everything is under control," Tom replied. "Just a little technical problem." "Technical problems?" the voice shouted. "3 complaints in 1 week. Are you out of your minds?" Edward strained his ears to hear more, but at that moment Mike walked over. "Hey, new guy, help me with that Mercedes." The whole day passed in tense anticipation. Edward noticed that after Wilson's visit, Tom called an urgent meeting with Peter and Robert, and they were actively discussing something, waving their hands. Around 6 in the evening, when the workshop was closing, Edward saw Peter hastily packing some documents into a briefcase. "Where are you going?" Tom asked, appearing in the doorway. "I have to take care of something," Peter replied, looking around nervously. "What kind of business at night, you know? After Wilson's visit?" Tom nodded. "Okay, just be careful." Edward decided that this was his chance. He quickly gathered his things and followed Peter out. It was easy to go unnoticed in the darkness of the evening city. Peter got into his old Honda and drove off in the direction of the industrial district. Edward kept a safe distance, occasionally letting a few cars pass between them. 20 minutes later, the Honda turned into an abandoned parking lot near an old warehouse. Edward parked around the corner and cautiously walked closer. There was another car at the entrance to the warehouse, a dark SUV with tinted windows. Peter walked up to it, looked around, and handed the driver a briefcase with documents. Edward took out his phone and started filming. Suddenly, he hit an empty jar lying on the ground. The sound seemed deafening in the silence of the night. Peter turned sharply. "Who's there?" Edward pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be heard throughout the parking lot. "Is someone there?" a voice asked from the car. "Probably cats," Peter answered, but he sounded uncertain. The SUV jerked away. Peter looked around again and quickly walked to his car. Edward waited until the Honda disappeared around the corner and only then exhaled. He checked his phone. He had managed to capture the moment of the document handover, although the video quality in the dark was not the best. When he got home, he immediately called Alex. "I have something interesting. I'm sending you the video." "Good," his friend replied, "but be careful. If they've noticed the surveillance—" "I don't think so." Peter was too scared to look around. "Still, they might be paranoid after Wilson's visit." Edward sat over his notes for a long time, trying to connect the dots. Wilson's visit and the stranger's visit clearly scared the whole team. Perhaps someone upstairs had begun to suspect something. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Edward froze. He was not expecting anyone so late. He quietly went to the door and looked through the peephole. Elizabeth was standing outside the door. "Daddy, open up! I know you're home." He opened the door. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to make sure you were okay," she replied as she entered the apartment. "What's going on? Why are you living in this horrible apartment? And why are you lying to me about the business trip?" "Honey, I can't explain everything right now." "Can't or won't?" Tears glistened in her eyes. "I can see that something is wrong. You've changed. You've become somehow different." Edward sighed heavily. "Listen, I'm investigating a case. It's important and dangerous. So the less you know, the better. But I can help you." "No," he answered sharply. "It's too dangerous. Promise me you won't tell anyone you were here." "Dad, promise." "Okay," she looked down. "I promise. But you have to promise to be careful too." "I will." He hugged his daughter. "Now go home. And don't come here anymore." When Elizabeth left, Edward stood by the window for a long time. He hated to lie to his daughter, but now he was too close to uncovering the whole scheme. One careless step and everything could be ruined. The phone rang again. "Alex, listen, there's something interesting. I ran the license plate of that SUV. It's registered to a company with ties to Wilson. That's it. Looks like they decided to cover their tracks after today's visit. Be careful. If they panic, they might do something stupid. Edward looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. Tomorrow would be a difficult day. But he was ready for anything. There was too much at stake to back down now. Saturday was unusually cool for late October. Edward parked his worn-out Ford in the parking lot of the car repair shop at 7:30, half an hour before his shift started. His attention was immediately drawn to 3 black Mercedes S-Classes with German license plates parked at the entrance. Something's wrong, he thought, noticing 2 burly men in black suits scrutinizing everyone who entered the building. "Passport," one of them said dryly as Edward approached the entrance. "I work here," he replied, showing his work badge. "Let me see it anyway." Edward pulled out some documents in the name of David Miller. The guard studied them for a long time, checking them against a list on his tablet. The atmosphere in the workshop was tense. Instead of the usual smell of oil and exhaust gases, there was an expensive perfume in the air. The mechanics stood in groups, whispering nervously. "David!" Chris called out to him. "Did you hear that? Some German bosses are here. Tom was up all night preparing the documents." "Who are they?" "I don't know, but Robert says it has something to do with those spare parts." At that moment, a group of people came out of Tom's office. A tall blond man in his 50s with a military bearing and a thin scar on his left cheek was leading the way. He was accompanied by 4 men in expensive suits. "Everyone gather in the main hall," Tom announced, looking pale and anxious. "It's urgent." The mechanics began to flock to the center of the workshop. Edward took a seat near the old lift where he could watch everyone. "Gentlemen," Tom began in a trembling voice, "allow me to introduce Sir Kraus and his team. They represent our European partners." Kraus looked around the room with a cold, assessing gaze. "Good morning. I represent Euro Auto Parts GmbH. Let's just say we provide quality spare parts to many services in Europe." Edward noticed how tense Peter became at these words. The senior mechanic nervously crumpled an oily rag in his hands. After a general presentation, everyone was divided into groups for detailed instruction. Edward found himself with Robert, who had already taken to the bottle. "You know," he muttered, staggering, "this is starting to scare me. It used to be easy. You could inflate the price of the repair, put in a cheap Chinese copy instead of the original, and everyone was happy. And now?" He looked around nervously. "These Germans, they are serious guys. I heard that in Poland. One mechanic tried to cheat them by selling their goods on the side. They haven't found him yet." "Maybe he just quit," Edward suggested cautiously. Robert laughed hysterically. "Quit? Yeah, for good. They say his car was found at the bottom of the lake." At that moment, one of Kraus's men approached them. "David Miller? Mr. Kraus wants to talk to you, in private." Edward felt his heart skip a beat. In Tom's office, besides Kraus, there was another man, the same one he had seen with Wilson. "Sit down, Mr. Miller," Kraus said, pointing to a chair. "Or should I call you Mr. Brown?" Edward felt a cold sweat trickle down his back, but his face remained calm. "I don't know what you mean." Kraus smiled. "Don't complicate things. We know everything. Edward Brown, owner of the Auto Pro car service network. He graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in business administration. He is a widower, has a daughter. Elizabeth, 23 years old, works in a marketing agency on Madison Avenue." He paused. "Have I missed anything? What do you want?" "I want to talk, but not here. Tonight at 10 in the evening, warehouse on Industrial Street, Building 7. Come alone." "And if I refuse?" Kraus took out his phone and showed me a photo of Elizabeth leaving the office. "She's a beautiful girl. It would be a shame if she got hit by a car, wouldn't it?" Edward felt his eyes darken with rage. "If you lay a finger on her, that's up to you, Mr. Brown. 10 o'clock at night. Don't be late." Edward left the office on shaky legs and headed for his car. He realized that he could not solve this situation alone. The stakes are too high, the people involved are too dangerous. "Alex," he said when his friend picked up the phone, "we're in serious trouble. They know who I am and they're threatening Elizabeth." "Oh my God, how did they know?" "I don't know. But it doesn't matter anymore. We have to go official. Get on the phone with Colonel Davidson in the Organized Crime Unit. I'm on my way to see him right now." "Are you sure?" Yeah. No more games. There's an international criminal organization involved. This is no longer a joke with fake spare parts. This is something much more serious." 40 minutes later, Edward was already sitting in the office of Colonel Davidson, a stout man of about 50 with graying temples. "The Germans, then," the colonel said thoughtfully after listening to the story. "It may be connected with that case in Hamburg. We've been following the Krause group for 6 months now." "What's the case?" "Last year, a large batch of smuggled spare parts was seized in the port of Hamburg. They traced it back to some Euro auto parts, but they couldn't prove anything. Now they seem to have decided to expand their business to the United States." Davidson pulled out a thick file from the cabinet. "Look, there have been several suspicious deaths in 3 states over the past year. All of the victims are connected to the auto business, and shortly before their deaths, each had contact with Krause's people." Edward felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. "They made an appointment for me, tonight at 10 at the warehouse." "Great," the colonel nodded. "This is our chance to take them in with the evidence, but first we have to take care of your daughter." He picked up the phone. "Jackson? I need you to organize protection for Miss Brown immediately. Yeah, I want a full-scale defense. And get me Ramirez and have him prepare a hit squad." Turning back to Edward, "You will go to the meeting, but not alone. We will organize everything." The next few hours flew by in intense preparation. Edward was equipped with listening equipment and briefed. The capture team studied the plans of the warehouse and the surrounding area. "The most important thing is not to show that you are aware of our operation," Davidson instructed. "Just act natural. We need them to make their demands clear and unambiguous." At 9 o'clock we received a message. Elizabeth was safely delivered to a secure location under guard. Edward relaxed a little. At least his daughter was safe. "It's time," Davidson said, looking at his watch. "Are you ready?" Edward nodded. He felt strangely calm. For the first time in this investigation, he wasn't alone. He had professionals behind him. "But no heroics," the colonel warned. "Your task is simply to talk to them. Everything else is our job." As Edward got into his old Ford, the voice of an operative came through the earpiece. "Everything is working fine. We can hear you. The capture team is in position." It's now or never, Edward thought as he started the engine. He had a crucial meeting ahead of him, but this time he knew help was at hand. 5 minutes before the appointed time, he parked near the warehouse. In the darkness, he could see several silhouettes. Krause's men were already waiting. "Everything will be fine," Davidson's calm voice came through the earpiece. "We're right here." Edward took a deep breath and got out of the car. It was time to put an end to this story. Edward got out of the car in complete darkness. The only source of light was the dim lights along the fence and the moonlight reflecting off the asphalt wet from the rain. 3 people were waiting for him at the entrance to the warehouse, Krause and 2 guards. "Punctuality is a virtue, Mr. Brown," the German smiled. "Please follow me." Davidson's quiet voice came through the earpiece. "Everything is fine. The cover team is in position." Inside the warehouse was a huge room filled with containers and boxes. A makeshift office was set up in the middle, a table, a few chairs, and a laptop. "Have a seat," Krause pointed to a chair. "Whiskey?" "No, thanks. As you wish." He poured himself a drink. "You know, Mr. Brown, I've been studying your biography. It's an impressive success story from a simple mechanic to the owner of a chain of car repair shops. You didn't invite me here for small talk. Kraus smiled. Straightforwardness is another virtue. Okay, let's get down to business. He took a folder out of his briefcase. Here are the documents on all the non-standard operations in your network over the past year. Fake spare parts, fake repairs, kickbacks. Very interesting reading for the tax authorities or the police. What do you want? Cooperation, Mr. Brown. Your network is ideal for our logistical needs. You mean smuggling parts? Kraus laughed. Oh, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Spare parts are just a cover. The main business is much more interesting. Davidson's voice came through the earpiece. Put pressure on him. Let him reveal more details. And what kind of business is that? Edward asked. Let's put it this way. There are many valuable things that need to be moved between continents, and your services are the perfect cover. Who will check trucks with spare parts? Drugs? And not only. Diamonds, gold, weapons. The market is huge. Edward felt his insides go cold. This isn't just a scam anymore. It's an international criminal organization. What if I refuse? Kraus sighed. Don't make it harder than it has to be, Mr. Brown. You have a wonderful daughter. It would be a shame. Don't touch her, Edward interrupted him sharply. It's up to you. Think of the advantages. Huge profits, international connections, full protection from the authorities. At this point, the lights suddenly went out in the room. A loud voice said, "Everyone on the floor! The police are here!" Spotlights flashed. Armed men in bulletproof vests ran from all sides to the center of the warehouse. "Treason!" one of Kraus's guards shouted, grabbing his gun. "No sudden movements!" Davidson's voice rang out. "Everyone on the floor, hands on your head!" Kraus tried to get something out of his briefcase, but the policeman immediately knocked him down. "All clear," one of the operatives reported. "The perimeter is under control." Edward was quickly taken outside. There were already several police cars with their lights on. "Are you okay?" Davidson asked, approaching him. "Yeah. What about Elizabeth?" "She's fine. She's under guard in a secure location. The detainees have been removed from the warehouse." Kraus, now in handcuffs, gave Edward a hateful look. "You have made a huge mistake, Mr. Brown. We have long arms." "Shut up!" One of the policemen interrupted him rudely, pushing him into the car. "Did you find anything?" Edward asked Davidson. "Oh yeah, the containers are full of evidence. Drugs, weapons, documents. This is the biggest operation in the last 5 years." A young officer approached them. "Sir, you have to see this. We found a computer with a database. It has information about their entire network, from Europe to Asia." "Great," the colonel nodded. "Pass it on to Interpol. Let them prepare an international operation." Edward watched the police cars leave the warehouse one by one. It was all over so suddenly. "What now?" he asked Davidson. "Now what?" "Now the fun begins. Interrogations, trials, international investigations. But that's our job." "What about my network?" "There will be an audit, of course. But given your cooperation with the police, I think everything will be fine. The main thing is that we caught a big fish." Edward rubbed his eyes tiredly. "May I go to my daughter?" "Of course. Jackson will take you there. And thank you for your help. We never would have gotten them without you." On the way to the safety of his home, Edward thought about everything that had happened. His little investigation had exposed an international criminal organization. Who would have thought? Elizabeth threw her arms around his neck as soon as he crossed the threshold. "Dad, you scared me so much. What's going on?" "It's all right, dear. Everything will be all right now." He hugged his daughter tightly, feeling the tension of the past few weeks slowly ease. There is still a lot of work to be done. The network's reputation needs to be restored. Management needs to be changed. New processes need to be established. But the main thing is that the worst is over. A month has passed since the dramatic events at the warehouse. Edward was sitting in his renovated office on the 30th floor, looking through reports. On the table was a fresh newspaper with the headline, "International Criminal Organization Defeated. More than 100 people arrested in 5 countries." There was a knock on the door. It was Margaret, his faithful secretary. "Mr. Brown, Colonel Davidson is waiting for you." Davidson looked tired but pleased. "Hello? We've just received confirmation that Krause has agreed to a deal with the investigation. He's given up the entire network." "How serious is it?" "More than we thought." The colonel sat back in his chair. 15 countries, hundreds of front companies, billions of dollars. They used car repair shops as a cover for smuggling drugs, weapons, diamonds. He pulled out a folder. "By the way, we found documents on how they infiltrated your network. It turns out that Tom had been working for them for 3 years. At first he was just selling fake parts then. And Wilson? Oh, that's an interesting story. He was a double agent. He worked for them and for competitors. It was his greed that made the whole scheme fall apart." Edward went to the window, looking at the city below. "You know, I still can't believe that it all started with a simple check of the financial statements." "Sometimes the biggest things start with the smallest things," Davidson said philosophically. "By the way, how is your network doing?" "We are recovering. I fired half of the management and hired new people. We have a new quality control system in place." "And the mechanics?" "Most of them stayed. It turned out that many were simply afraid to speak up. Now we have an anonymous line for reporting violations." At that moment the door opened and it was Elizabeth. "Dad, Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had a meeting." "It's okay, I'm on my way," Davidson smiled. "By the way, tomorrow there's a press conference at the police department. Will you be there?" "Of course." When the colonel left, Elizabeth sat down opposite her father. "I still can't believe you were a secret agent." "Not an agent," Edward laughed. "I was just trying to figure out what was going on in my business, and risking your life. I'm sorry I scared you, but I had to do it." Elizabeth came over and hugged him. "I'm proud of you, Dad." In the afternoon, Edward went to the main service center, the one where it all began. Now there was a new manager, a young and energetic Michael, whom he had personally selected from hundreds of candidates. "How are things going?" he asked, looking around the workshop. "Great," Michael answered. "Customers are coming back. Reputation is being restored. And do you know what's most interesting? The profit is even higher than it was before those schemes. Honest business is always more profitable in the long run." He walked around the workshop, watching the mechanics at work. Chris, now a senior mechanic, came over to say hello. "Mr. Brown, thank you for your trust. I won't let you down." "I know you will, Chris. That's why I promoted you." In the evening, Edward met Alex at their favorite bar. "Do you think it's over?" his friend asked. "I don't think so. Organizations like this always find a way to revive, but at least not in my company." "You've changed," Alex said. "You've become more serious. When you risk everything you have, it changes the way you look at life." They raised their glasses. "To honest business." The next day at a press conference, Edward sat next to Davidson, listening to the colonel tell reporters about the disclosure of an international criminal network. His name was mentioned as a brave businessman who helped the police. After the conference, a journalist approached him. "Mr. Brown, aren't you afraid of retaliation? Such organizations have long memories." "You know," he replied, "my biggest fear was not for myself, but that my business, which I had been building for years, was being used for crimes. Now I know that sometimes you have to risk everything to preserve the most important thing, your good name." In the evening, sitting in his office, Edward looked through photos from the past. Here he is as a young mechanic in his father's garage. Here is the opening of the first service. Here is the birth of Elizabeth. Life had taken an unexpected turn, but perhaps that was exactly what was supposed to happen. Now he knew for sure that there was nothing more important than honesty, to himself, to people, to the law. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from Davidson. "Edward, I have news. Interpol has found their accounts in Swiss banks. It's billions of dollars. And you know what? Part of the money will be returned to the state as compensation, including your company, for the damage caused." "Money is not the main thing," Edward replied. "The main thing is that everything ended right." He looked out the window at the evening city. Somewhere there, his services were working, now honest, transparent, reliable. And that was the most important thing. It was not just a victory over a criminal organization. It was a victory of principles over the temptation of easy money, of honesty over lies, of courage over fear. 3 months after the case was resolved, the AutoPro network of car service centers not only regained its position, but also expanded significantly. Edward introduced a new system of work that quickly became an example for the entire industry. "Look," he showed the board members the new concept. "Every customer gets full access to the repair history online. All spare parts have a QR code to check their originality. Each mechanic is certified on a quarterly basis." The innovations quickly brought results. Customers appreciated the transparency and honesty, and profits increased by 40%. "We are opening a training center," he told Elizabeth over dinner. "We will train a new generation of mechanics, with the right values and a professional approach." "What about that idea with charity?" "Yes, the Safe Roads program is already working. Once a month, our services check the cars of pensioners and low-income families for free. The new approach has attracted the attention of international partners. Major car manufacturers have started offering exclusive service contracts." "Your story is an example of how a crisis can become an opportunity," said a Mercedes-Benz representative during the signing of the contract. "You didn't just clean up your business, you created a new service culture." At the end of the year, Businessweek magazine named Edward Brown Entrepreneur of the Year in the automotive business. The article emphasized how he turned a difficult situation into an opportunity for innovation. "You know," he once told Alex, "sometimes I think that maybe all of this was meant to be. Otherwise, we would never have realized how outdated our system was." Now, every new employee at AutoPro took a special course in corporate ethics, where a separate section included a story about how honesty and integrity saved the company from collapse. "The main thing," Edward said at meetings with the staff, "is not profit but trust. Money comes and goes, but reputation remains forever." And it was true. AutoPro has become a symbol of honest business in the automotive industry, an example of how the right values can lead to real success.